So I often talk about reading nonfiction as well as fiction. I mean, through a lot of the stuff that I do online, it's obvious that I read fiction. And for example, the Two Johns podcast that I do with John Austin, the editor of Fresh Pulp Science Fiction magazine, we talk almost exclusively about fiction, not only novels but also films and television shows. But I do want to go through a stack of books that I have in my reading list. I'm reading bits and pieces of some of them, and some of them I'm reading straight through, that are nonfiction, and sort of explain what it is that I get out of them. So let's start with a dictionary. Now, if you're a follower of JNelsonLeaf.com, you know I used to do this piece called the archaic definition of the week, where I would take books like this and I would find some interesting word and include its definition in the to sort of bring it to light for modern audiences. And books like this are just fascinating, and they're the kind of books that you can read them straight through if you want to, but they also just have little tidbits everywhere. Like, for example, when you're talking about, okay, here's a list of dishes from Georgia and London, and one of them is Grunter's Gig, and Grunter's Gig is smoked pig face. Now, that's something you're probably not going to hear a lot about in 2018. So books like this are fantastic. They're really fascinating to me. Here's another one, a similar book I bought at the same time, called Regency Slang Revealed, and it has the same sort of organization, is that it's organized by subject rather than as a straight dictionary. And so you have a lot of lists of things like words for ale. So you have humming liquor or knock me down, which of course makes sense. Lamb's wool, that might be something that you didn't expect. But lamb's wool is specifically described here as apples roasted and put into strong ale, which sounds delicious to me. And the last of the three books that I recently bought in this vein, all at the same time, is a classical dictionary of the vulgar tongue. And this one was this one actually, I believe, was published in the period, and it's a sort of a peek into what common people call things. For example, they call the knave of clubs from a standard deck of cards, they call it a Pam. Didn't know that before, but it's full. I mean, it's just full of interesting insights like this, and you can go through here and just for your own enjoyment, or if you're writing a story in the period and you want to give it an air of verisimilitude, you can throw stuff in here. And some phrases have lasted. Like, for example, here's one under the entry for oats that says, "He has sowed his wild oats." Well, that we still use that today. So anyway, interesting nonfiction. Now, here is a book that I recently bought because I bought this at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is in D.C., very near where I live. And the reason I bought this is because I became very intrigued by the different ways that different native cultures not just in North America, actually, around the world, how they read and interpret cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. And as it turns out, different cultures in North America and around the world interpret these in different ways. They assign them different meanings, different colors, different aspects of nature, and it's really fascinating to see how that plays out in different cultures, and try to you see patterns, you see anomalies that break the patterns, and I just find that stuff fascinating. And if you've read any of my fiction, you probably know that you probably are like, yeah, that kind of features into a lot of the things that he writes. And as I was sort of looking into that, it also occurred to me that the 8 different personality types that were elucidated by Carl Jung sort of played into this. If you take not only the cardinal directions of north, south, east, west, but also northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. You can sort of build a typology, which is something that I'm kind of working on. I'm working on a role-playing game concept that builds on this eightfold typology that includes elements and sort of an elaboration on the classical four elements of antiquity and personality types, and looking into different cultural and mythological systems to sort of pull together a single coherent eightfold system. So I got this. I had read this a long time ago when I was in college, but I didn't have a copy. And as I was doing research on directions and personality types and temperaments, I kept seeing it referenced. So I thought, you need to get a copy of that so that you can read those quotes in context and make better sense of it. So this is probably something I'm not going to read all the way through again. As a matter of fact, I didn't read it all the way through in college. We were assigned specific parts to read, and I'm just going to use it to check up on the quotes that I bump into as I'm looking into temperaments and the psychology that I'd like to build into this eightfold typology that I'm working on. This book was actually recommended to me by a good friend of mine, and I was surprised when she mentioned to me that she was reading it, because I thought, well, why? And what it is it's a series of essays and excerpts from other works. Some are papers that were published in journals and things like that go into the different ways. It's basically anthropology. They go into the different ways that cultures around the world deal with death, deal with loss, deal with the funeral rituals, and what death means for the status of the person who died in the culture, what it means for the status of their relatives, their close relatives, particularly their children, their spouses, and how different. It's a really fascinating book, because it goes into things that I think for modern people, particularly in the West, you'd think, well, that doesn't sound like anything that I'm familiar with at all. It's a lot of the concepts in here are just fascinating. The way that different peoples around the world have approached and processed what can be a very painful and stressful experience. Not for the dead person, but for the people that they leave behind. So this one I'm kind of reading straight through. I've skipped around a little bit, but I really want to make sure that I get every part of this in my head so that I can, use it in other parts of my things that I do, things that I write, things that I think about. And now we got a series of books again that I bought all together because it was just an inspiration that I had, that I wanted to learn more about the history of settlements around Washington, D.C., particularly before there was a Washington, D.C., simply because I'm just fascinated with that part of history, the Age of Sail. So I got Chronicles of Georgetown, and this was, of course, it says Georgetown, D.C., and that refers to a period of time when the district did exist. Well, actually before, because it starts in 1751, but for a time, Georgetown was considered a separate city from Washington. Washington was largely confined to an area around the mall, what we would now call the mall area, and it didn't extend into places like Chevy Chase and Columbia Heights and places like that. And Georgetown was its own city at that point. This book is, for the little bits that I've read of it, very fascinating. And the thing that I really like about books like this is that it gets you into the sort of things that were happening to everyday people in everyday life, that, the sort of things that if you were living in that period of time, you would read in the newspaper and it would just be the talk of the street. So that sort of stuff is really fascinating to me, because it's not the sort of thing that you're going to get from a sort of generic historical overview of the period. And in that same light, I got Remembering Georgetown, which has a really fascinating little map, which is, I just find that stuff, looking at things like this, just really fascinating. Look at that. And this is more of an overview. It doesn't have as much details from the period as the previous book that I just showed you, the Chronicles. But it's still fascinating, and it's it helps balance out when you get, I always like to look for anything that I want to know something about. It's really important to me to not just take one perspective's view on it. If you're only taking one voice on any subject, you're probably not getting it right. So it's good to take things from different angles and sort of compare them together and see what it is. Try to dig into the truth from multiple directions, and you're more likely to get an accurate view that way on anything, whether it's history or politics or science. And this one similarly, but this one is about Alexandria, and it's more like the first one I showed, which because it's more period events, and it has like editorial notices from Alexandria during the this period, which is covering 1669 to 1883. That goes a little beyond. I start to lose interest once it starts to get into the mid to late 1800s. But it has actual period publications. So that's fascinating too, because you get to see the different types of fonts and stuff that people were using back then, and a lot of design things that can help you when you're if you're trying to create anything that's a period representation. So these sorts of things are just really fascinating to me, and can be helpful if you're a writer or you're a designer or you're a role-playing gamer, to help make things more realistic and or at least similar to the real world. Now this one, I have been digging in. As you can see, it's very thick, and it's very academic, and the text is very small. So it's probably going to take me a while to get through, but it's another one that I really want to get through in its entirety. It's called Erich Neumann, this is a very well-known book in its field. It's called The Great Mother, and this is something in a vein of academic thought that I'm very interested in, which is the female archetype in religion. Following that, I've read every book. I think I may have missed a couple, but I've read every book, for example, that Margaret Barker is a fantastic academic, and I'm eagerly awaiting her next book. And the entire subject is very fascinating. I mean, the masculine archetypes in religion also fascinating, but this particular the Great Mother and other female archetypes in religion, very fascinating to me. So I like to look into this, keep it somewhere in my to read file at all times. There's going to be some book like that. This I also got at the National Museum for the American Indian. It's a history of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, or the Caribbean, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Obviously, I picked Caribbean, and it's quasi-academic. It's very serious. It's not a sort of casual history, and it goes into myth and material culture, as you can see. And it's just fascinating, because it's one of those things that we tend to think of the Caribbean as sort of coming into being during the Pirate Age, but there was so much stuff going on before then, and people moving around before things started to get written down. And that's something that fascinates me. It intrigues me in general. So anytime that I can get something that gives some insight into what people were doing before the records started to be kept, I like to get things like that, read them and let them sink into my brain bones. This is a used book, and this is similarly. I'm not only interested in what happened in the Caribbean before records started to be kept, but also the Mediterranean. Two sort of similar regions with a lot of islands and people boating around from one island to the next. And this is Islands in Time. I have to show you the title page because there's no cover. It's a used hardback, and it's basically the same concept as the previous book, but it's about Mediterranean prehistory, and I'm very fascinated by that, particularly when you get into Things like, who were the Pelasgians that the Greeks were talking about? Who were the Tyrrhenians? And are they the same people? Things about the indigenous peoples of Sicily and Sardinia before the Greeks and the Romans and the Carthaginians showed up. That sort of thing is really fascinating to me. And so I got this to have a resource and something to read to sort of get into that. And I'll probably do a lot of contrast to compare with the Caribbean book that I got, sort of find patterns and exceptions to patterns and things, how they break out. And in that, because, like I said, the Pelasgians and the Tyrrhenians and other people, other non-Indo-European people who were in the Mediterranean before the ancestors of the Italians and the Greeks showed up from inland Europe. One of the people who talk about this a lot in the ancient world was Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and particularly in his first book on Roman antiquity. So I got that because I kept seeing it quoted, and I wanted to have the quotes myself so that I could reference them and, of course, read them in context to see if there were more. Very often when someone quotes an author, they quote it for a very specific purpose, and you actually go look up the quote yourself. What do you find? You find that there's something that's more interesting to you right before or right after it. Details that the author that you read the quote did not think was worth saying, but you'll find it fascinating in a way that they didn't. Finally, and you may be noticing a pattern here, this is also a book about the ancient Mediterranean world, but it's a little later. It's in the historical period. But I was fascinated. I'm also fascinated by not just how people moved around and what kind of pottery they built and what kind of religion, or how they organized their cultures and how they lived, but also their economic life. So this book is called The Open Sea, and it's all about the economic life of the Mediterranean from the Iron Age to the rise of Rome. And to me, that's a good stopping point for me, because you're so inundated. You're inundated by information about Rome in history class and just in popular culture, that to me the fascinating thing is, well, what happened before that? What happened, what's the prequel to Rome? And so anytime I can find a book that says, yeah, here's a history, and we stop at the point where you kind of already know a lot of what happened. That's my stack of books. That's my to-read file right now, and I'm burning my way through it slowly. I mean, I also have, of course, a fiction book. I have the first novella in the Murderbot series by Martha Wells. It's called All Systems Red. It's a fascinating book. I'm reading that for the sci-fi podcast I do with John. But this is my nonfiction pile, which is always larger, and it's the nonfiction part of my library. Of course, it just dwarfs the fiction part. I do like fiction a lot, but nonfiction is really what I like more. And so, if you like fiction, consider adding a couple of nonfiction books, things that are, whatever it is that you like in fiction. Find nonfiction that relates to that, so that you can. It really helps as you're reading nonfiction. Like if you let's say, just to take the cliche, let's say you like reading fiction or watching movies or watching television shows about the Age of Sail the way that I do. Well, if you read nonfiction and you kind of learn the way that that ships were taken care of by their crew, and you learn different ways about different things about the way that they moved from port to port and traded goods and things like that. When you see those things in the fiction that you read or you watch on television, you're watching the movies, you'll go, oh, see that little thing in the background? It gives you all these Easter eggs, because you can bet that the writers of those things that you watch and that you read probably did their research, and they added these little things in there that that would give it that sort of sense of realism. And if you don't know, though, you're going to miss a lot of the stuff that would just make your reading experience and your watching experience a lot more fascinating, a lot more enjoyable. So go ahead and keep reading and watching fiction, but also every once in a while slip a little nonfiction in there, and you'll find that it really enhances your ability to enjoy fiction.